This episode of the EV Resource Podcast is brought to you by Titan Auto and Tire. Titan has some of the very few independent auto repair shops in Central Virginia that are qualified to work on EVs and hybrids. And from hybrids to Hummers, they fix everything. For more information and to schedule an appointment for your vehicle, go to TitanAutoTire.com. Coming up this week, we're going to talk about the EV tax credit starting this year. It's acting a bit different. China has some EVs that they're looking to bring over to North America. And what is it like to charge an electric vehicle in a flood? Well, we're going to get into all of that and more. I'm joined by Jon Hurst again, and we're going to talk about the news. So hello, friends, and welcome to episode 181 of the EV Resource Podcast. I'm Zach Hurst, and each week I bring you the latest EV news, information, and interviews with industry experts. Jon, thanks for joining me again. I know this is going to be a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me. I am just here being some guy having a lot of fun.
Some guy having a lot of fun. Well, that makes two of us. So let's just get right into it. I have been reading a lot recently about China and EVs and the affordable EV that really North American consumers want coming from Chinese brands. So I want to dive into that. I'm curious. I know I sent you a couple articles, but I'm curious kind of what your thoughts are and your overall take before we dive into any individual details.
Well, my first reaction was, yes, it's about time we get affordable EVs. My next reaction was, oh crap, China stuff has a tendency to be kind of sketchy in ways. Like there's plenty of cheap Chinese stuff, memes out there. And then my next thought was, well, BYD has been doing pretty well in terms of quality control. I mean, as good as anybody else, it feels like. So I'm really kind of conflicted on this. On one hand, it seems really good, and on the other hand, I'm honestly a little bit nervous. But in terms of all the political stuff, like, I don't know, my personal opinion is, why does it always have to be a competition with China? Why can't we work together for the greater good? And maybe EVs end up being the thing that brings us together in that regard. I'm not saying that we're gonna solve the world's problems with bringing Chinese EVs to the United States, but I don't know. Maybe it could be a good thing.
Okay, all right. You mentioned 2 points. The first, getting into the quality of the technology. Now, yeah. I haven't experienced any Chinese-made electric vehicles myself. I have not been fortunate enough to be able to go over to China, or some of the times when they've had press events here in the U.S., it's all been on the West Coast. So all I have to go off of is what I read or hear from other people that I know that have experienced them. So. Yeah. Take that with a grain of salt, if you will. I mean, certainly it's not first person. But my understanding is that the quality of Chinese EVs is actually pretty good.
That's good.
I have not. I mean, I suppose you have to look at what that means, because certainly, yes, there are going to be Chinese-made electric vehicles that are cheap, both in quality as well as price, right?
Well, that being said, I think there might be at least a couple of recalls in U.S. made or EVs that are being made elsewhere at the moment, or cars in general. So, I mean, there's going to be quality issues when you're building anything at volume, but
sure, nothing's perfect.
Yeah.
I guess where I was going with that is my understanding that BYD, which BYD actually is the world's leading manufacturer of plug-in vehicles. Tesla is number one.
Volume? Like they sell the most volume?
Sales units, yes.
Okay.
So Tesla is number one for full battery electric vehicles, but BYD, once you include plug-in hybrids, that catapults them to the number one spot. They are doing very well, and they have some products that are full battery electric that are extremely desirable and much more affordable than what we're used to here in the US. So I don't think
Do
quality is going to be an issue. Service, on the other hand, is where I start to go, will that work?
what
Will
does
they
that mean?
have, well, will they have dealerships where if the
Uh,
car has a problem, you can take it there, or will they have service centers like we see with Rivian or um, actually Fisker? They have service centers. So if something happens and they can't handle it with a mobile technician that comes to you to fix whatever the problem is, then you can have it put on a flatbed and towed to wherever their service center is.
well,
So,
hey, if BYD does a better job at quality than Fisker, I think we're okay.
uh, yeah, I won't get into it. I saw the Fisker Ocean for the first time yesterday, and I was very impressed. Um, so like BYD, Neo, Xpeng, um, those are the top three brands from China that I would say I am worried about and excited about. And that gets to the second point that you mentioned, where I'm excited because having more affordable options, competition drives market prices down. What I'm worried about is what that will do to some of the US manufacturers that are already struggling to figure out how to make affordable EVs profitably.
I don't know. I mean, if you believe in capitalism, then in theory, this should be a good thing.
Yeah.
They're going to have to find ways to innovate. They're going to have to, I mean, there is a problem. I mean, a lot of what capitalism is all about is identifying problems and fixing them. So, I mean, if we believe in what we have, then in theory, this should be a good thing. And if they can't, then what are they doing making EVs in the first place?
Well, you could
I
say
don't know. That's
what
just
are they
one school
doing
of thought anyway.
making cars in the first place, right? I
Yeah.
mean, in 2008, the federal government bailed out a couple of manufacturers, GM being the big one. I believe Ford and Tesla at this point were the only ones that ever repaid the money that they got from
Well, and
that.
Ford didn't get a whole heck of a lot because they
Uh,
had made some. I think they got lucky. They had made some moves before, not realizing that there was going to be kind of recession going on, and they just happened to be lucky, as far as I understand.
okay, yeah, I mean
But
nobody's got a crystal ball.
exactly,
I think U.S. manufacturers should be worried about competition from China, and I've heard two things related to this. One has been said, well, we need tariffs and whatnot on Chinese goods to essentially make them cost more, so that we encourage U.S. and North American buyers to buy things made and manufactured here.
well,
How,
why are cars so cheap coming from China? And can we do the same?
and I don't have those answers. I mean, I could speculate, but I don't know for sure, and I don't want to just point my finger at like cheap labor or anything else that is the automatic kind of go
Government
to.
involvement. I mean,
Yeah.
if it ends up being government involvement, then in theory we could do the same, whether we have the willingness to make that step, or if it's just going to be called socialism and move on.
Well,
That's yet to be seen.
we already do, really. I mean, the government subsidies involved in
Yeah.
the auto industry and not just EVs. I mean, honestly, the EV part of it is probably the lowest. When you look at the oil and gas industry, it's extremely subsidized by the
Agriculture,
federal
the
government.
agriculture industry. I
Uh,
mean, that's the only way we have food.
well, I mean, it's an intricate web where
Yeah.
you can't just make blanket statements to go, all right, well, this is going to apply to everything. Um, what I know BYD is doing is building a manufacturing plant in Mexico. They've got a battery plant. I believe it's going in Tennessee, if I recall
And
correctly.
do they develop like all their own drivetrain and battery materials, or are they getting some parts or systems from other manufacturers?
I believe, well, every car manufacturer is going to get some parts from somebody else, right? They don't make everything,
Yeah,
but the
sure.
major components like your drivetrain or your battery, I believe that BYD is making their own or is partnered with very, very specific suppliers in a similar way that Tesla has.
Okay.
So what they're doing is essentially seeing the rules that were put in place in terms of supply chain for tax credits for vehicles that we sell in the US here, and they're going, okay, well, we can play by those rules. So having a tariff on Chinese goods wouldn't apply to BYD making
Good.
things here in North America. So I mean, I said nobody has a crystal ball.
I don't know.
Neither do I. I don't know
There's
what to
plenty of people
expect.
not making TikTok videos in China either, and we see how that went.
I am not sure that that's a fair comparison
Probably not.
because BYD, like, I mean,
That's
let's
what I'm
just
here
look,
for. Unfair comparisons.
there you go. Let's look at like what the 70s and 80s when Toyota and Honda in Japan was really starting to, we'll call it, invade the US auto market. They brought in affordable, low cost vehicles that people really wanted. Quality wasn't there at first, but now look, I mean, when you talk about automotive quality, Toyota is one of the first names in your mouth. Like,
Yeah.
I think that BYD especially, but also Neo and Xpeng, I think that they've got a really good chance of being top sellers in the US market. And if I were in GM's position, I'd be really worried.
I think coming from the computer side of things, knowing that BYD controls a lot of their design and well, I don't know about supply chain, but a lot of what goes into their cars they have control over, and they're not outsourcing a whole lot of stuff. Bodes well because the other place that I've seen doing a whole lot of that is Apple. Apple does hardware, software, and yeah, they work with Foxconn on the motherboards or Intel or they had worked with Intel on the processors until they switched to the M1 chips a little while ago. But knowing that the company has that much control over what they're doing, then if something goes wrong, then they can't point at somebody else and say, oh, that's their problem necessarily. They say, okay, well, this is our problem. We're going to fix it. They do fix it. And you end up with a higher quality product, over time. So that seems pretty good to me.
You could say the same about Tesla too. They are extremely vertically integrated. And
vertical
the
integration.
more people inside the automotive industry that I talk to, that never used to be the most efficient way to build cars. It was always have, your supply chain spread out.
You do what you do best, and then other people do what they do best and take advantage of that.
I don't think that is possible anymore because Tesla has done what they've done. When you involve labor and transportation and shipping costs and everything from all these suppliers, those costs add up and mean you cannot sell a vehicle for as low of a price as your competitors who are vertically integrated. And I mean, this has been something that we've seen throughout the human history of industry, even back when, the turn of the 20th century or earlier, really the late 19th century with the rail industry and steel industries. Vertically integrated. Well, you don't have as many costs along the supply chain as you do if you're not.
And if there's somebody that does something really good, then you just buy them.
Right. Right. Or if you see your competitors using a supplier that's doing something really good for your competitors, you buy that company so your competitors don't have them anymore.
I'm surprised TSMC is so is independent still, but they have a lot of big clients making chips for all kinds of places like NVIDIA, Intel, AMD. Well, okay. Intel's doing a lot.
I didn't know who TSMC was.
If you haven't heard of TSMC, you will eventually.
Oh, okay. Perhaps
they may end up making chips for electric cars. So
All right. I'll have to look into it then if it's related
Yeah,
in one way or another.
they're a chip foundry, processor foundry, basically.
Cool. So the Chinese EVs, I think they're going to be good quality, and they don't have to be as good as what Americans are used to if the price is offset in accounting for that. Where if we
And you
get
can get them fixed. If there's an issue, like I
yes,
don't care if a company's got, some bugs to work out or whatever, if I have something wrong with what I bought, as long as they're going to say, okay, our bad, we'll fix it. If they're going to take responsibility for their own stuff, then I'm cool.
okay, and I would imagine many people feel the same way. They're gonna qualify if they're built and the batteries are made in North America. They're gonna qualify for the U.S. tax credit. So that's $7,500 that it used to be a tax credit where you had to have the taxable burden in order to
Right?
really benefit from it.
It's changed.
It's changed.
Give me the goods.
Yep. So for both new and used electric vehicles, the new tax credit up to $7,500, and it's still. Let me step back. You still need to have the vehicle qualify either for half or all of it. So it's not
Okay.
automatic on any EV. But on the person qualifying, if you do not have a tax burden, as it's been explained to me multiple times already, it acts as a rebate. So it is now applied to the price of the vehicle at the point of sale. So
Yo.
if you're at the dealership and you're buying a new EV, they will take $7,500 off of the price right then and there. And now you're buying a $7,500. You're buying a car that costs $7,500 less.
So, do you know of any cars that are in, say, the $40,000-$50,000 price range off the top of your head that would qualify? Like, what are some of the most popular cars that people could say, "Hey, that's something that I could look into now."
The
Whereas
Model
before
Y
it
is
might
the
have just been
first
like
one that
out of
pops into my
market.
head.
Say that again.
The Model Y is the first one that
Oh, the
pops
Model
into
Y.
my head.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's gonna be
I got to double
popular.
check on the Model 3. I know the performance Model 3 does qualify. The long range should, at least for some of it. The standard range, which uses the different battery cells, I do not know if Tesla is getting those made here in North America yet. So I'm not sure
Maybe that
about that. I got to
changes.
double check. But the full listing of all vehicles that qualify either for half or all of it is available on the IRS webpage. And I can
Oh,
put a link to that in the show notes so that anybody that's curious and wants to look, they can go see that. Um, that's probably the best thing to do instead of relying on whatever a salesperson at a dealership would tell you because they may not know.
yeah,
um,
that was I went into a Hyundai dealership recently, and their information was maybe 80% accurate, 75% accurate.
right. And
But
when you're talking about money, that's where you got to know it or it's like, dangerous. So, the used tax credit is up to $4,000. And there's some other vehicle requirements that I've talked about on the podcast
and I would
previously.
assume that has to come from a dealership because the dealership would get reimbursed. If you're buying private owner, then forget it.
Nothing. Right. So it has to be from a dealership. The dealership files paperwork with the IRS, gets reimbursed essentially for the 4 grand. Um, I've been hearing recently it's actually been fairly quickly, like within 4 to 6 weeks or something like that.
Maybe
Um,
FEMA can learn something from that.
so yeah, you could, and the car has to be at least 2 years old. So, for example, if you wanted to go out and buy a Chevy Bolt that was a 2021, you could find those for less than 20 grand, and now you're taking another $7,500 off of that.
Or 4,000 anyway.
Yes. Thank you. Another $4,000 off that. Well, that's pretty significant. And I recently was on a webinar where they were talking about all of this, and somebody asked the question, well, if it's at point of sale and you believe that you have the tax burden to fill out the paperwork, because you essentially have to tell the dealership that yes, you would qualify as a person for this. Apparently, at the end of the year, if it turns out that you don't have that tax burden, what I'm being told is, okay, no worries. The IRS is not willing to correct anything or work to facilitate getting that back. Like, it seems like it's acting as an immediate rebate.
I feel like the IRS probably has bigger fish to fry than $4,000, here and there.
I would think so.
Yeah.
At least I hope so.
Right.
So there are a lot of things going on that are going to really make EVs a lot more affordable for people here in the US. So that, I think, is probably the best news that I've heard in a number of years, because the people that need EVs the most are the people that can't go and spend a whole lot of money for a vehicle.
That could make it so that somebody who's got at least reasonable credit but still living paycheck to paycheck for the most part would be able to afford an EV. Either trade in what they have, or worst case scenario, you end up financing something, which is what most people are doing anyway. Mm-hmm. But if it makes a difference between 16 grand and 20 grand, that's a big chunk out of the monthly payment right there.
Yep.
And I mean, like, for me, what I was talking about last time we did the news, in terms of thinking $7,500 might work, and then going, oh, wait a minute, I don't have that tax burden because I'm using standard deduction. Then it wouldn't apply to me at all. Where now it's like, I really don't want to get rid of the Spark because I love that car. But in terms of my wife's car, we're leasing a Subaru right now, and well, honestly, she probably doesn't want to get rid of that either. But it very well could be that if this sticks for a little while, that we end up with a second EV, and that would be amazing.
Yeah. When it comes to leasing, you're going to have a lot more options. It's funny you mentioned the Hyundai dealership. Well,
honestly, I'd really like to not lease, but I might get booted off the island on that one.
I mean, look, whether you're leasing or making payments to the bank, it's about monthly cash flow, not the price of the vehicle necessarily. Now, I mean, obviously there's a lot more to all of that, and I know that. So yeah, it's like, I'm not just making a blanket statement based on ignorance. It's more for simplicity of the conversation.
That's another podcast on financial stuff.
Yeah. And you know what? I maybe I'll reach out to somebody that does specialize in automotive financing, or a couple. I don't know. We'll see. Actually, I'm going to write that down because that's not a bad idea.
Simplify things for the average Joe, because that is one of the concepts that gets real hairy real quick, especially there's a lot to be said for personal responsibility. If you walk into a dealership, for you to know a lot of accurate information, so that way you don't get run over. But
right.
In any case, this is news. So today in the news, you can now probably afford an EV.
I think we're going to start seeing that. However, I don't think we're going to see EVs much under $5,000 ever, which I know there's a lot of people that are searching for vehicles under $5,000. And the reason I say that is because the value of the battery, even if the car is a brick and it's died, you still have a battery that has all of those physical rare earth minerals, and if it's on a periodic table of elements, it can be recycled. So that battery, even as a non-working battery, is still going to have value to a recycler. So I think there's going to be a floor in terms of where we see prices go, because you're not going to buy a car for less than the value of its battery. Most likely. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I don't know. We'll see.
You're probably right.
So we talked about Chinese EVs. BYD is absolutely on their way at this point, like no doubt about it. And I know the other companies have been looking at North America and going, all right, well, maybe not quite yet. So they took care of Europe first.
Do you think this is actually something that I'm really curious about? Do you think that depending on what happens in politics, that it would speed up or slow down BYD's entry into the United States market?
If BYD is going to play by all the rules that they are putting in place in order to make a focus on North America, then, or any Chinese, any company, really, any foreign manufacturer that says, okay, if we want to apply for the, have our cars be qualified for the tax credit, then we'll build in North America. We'll use North American labor. We will use North American supply chain. I don't think you can stop that from happening. Where it gets gray and where I don't know a whole lot is, you had mentioned if the companies are being supported by the Chinese government in order to have low prices, how does that affect things? Like, can the Chinese government still support these companies if they're subsidiaries that are US based?
Somebody's going to have the fear that the Chinese government is, putting spy software into these cars. I mean,
sure,
somebody's going to think that.
The Chinese thought that about Tesla on the other way around, where you had rolling cameras going on to military bases. Yes, that will always be a concern. But that's not going to be a new concern. I mean, so much of our technology and software has Chinese ties that, for the charging side of things. Okay, well, Oasis Charging is now a reseller for equipment that is not directly a Chinese company, but they're a subsidiary down the line. Concern? Sure. So I actually, before making that agreement, that partnership, I said, look, this is a big concern. What are you guys doing? And basically they said that they are required, in order to do business with certain entities that are US based, to go through a process where they can be verified that there is nothing nefarious, no issue at all, for having any kind of data leak back to the Chinese government. So I think a lot of it is going to be driven by, if they want to sell to companies, those companies are going to have those requirements. And if they're going to sell to the public, I don't know what data protections are already in place in terms of the laws for the US, but I would imagine that that's very much going to be on the top of the list, going, no. We need to make sure that, this is, and more about the cybersecurity side of things than I do, but I'm sure it's going to be completely separate, firewalled off, or whatever needs to happen so that we won't worry about that.
It may end up being a situation like with Kaspersky, where the federal government is like, all right, no federal government employees are allowed to drive BYD cars, government fleet vehicles or something like that. But otherwise, it's like, okay, whatever.
Yeah. So we'll see. I think that one we'll have to wait to see kind of how things play out. Yeah,
I think it'll probably be fine.
I think it'll be fine
I mean,
too. And
I
I
hope
think we're
so.
going to have some really great, awesome cars that are extremely capable, that are built very well. And we're going to find them for well less than what US manufacturers want to sell EVs for.
Good deal.
So we kind of covered the first two things, the tax credit and the Chinese EVs. At the top of the show, when I was doing the introduction, I mentioned charging an electric vehicle in a flood. And this has been something that it's I don't recommend, even though I understand the science behind it. Um, I found this article, and I'm gonna try to share my screen here to pull it up. Um, let's see. Oh, I'm silly. I'm on the PC. The screen I wanted to share is on the Mac. I can't do that.
So
All
in any
right.
case,
Well,
the
I can.
guy
I,
was, yeah, go ahead.
well, I can put it up on when I edit everything. So you should be seeing the screen now. Where this article from the UK, where a man was driving through a flooded area in Oxfordshire, and
How deep are we talking here? Because that makes an impact on the visual here.
it looks from the pictures that were taken that the level of the water is higher than the bottom of the car. So, ankle deep at least. So maybe, a foot of water.
All right.
And he's driving a Tesla Model 3 and backs up to the supercharger and plugs in, gets back in his car, and sits there while the car is charging. This is not something I would do. Uh, However, I know that it's safe, but there's too many unknown variables that I'm like, that's why I wouldn't feel comfortable with it. Because, like, well, having your EVs can drive through flooded water, no problem, because there isn't like an intake that's going to suck in water and hydrolock an engine. But and the batteries are sealed, the motors are sealed, like all the electronics are pretty much going to be okay for short periods of time. But if you're sitting there, I I mean, it was fine, clearly. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is because for years now, we've seen this picture spread around the internet of a Tesla supercharger station in a flooded area. And they say, oh, you thought gas powered cars are dangerous or whatever. And the public impression is that water and electricity don't mix. So why would you put an electric car and charge, you know? Well, this really goes to how chargers work, where you can take the plug of the charger and just drop it into the water and nothing's going to happen. And the reason for that is there's no electricity going through those wires until many steps take place between communication of the car and the charger. So electricity only flows when the two entities here talk to each other and go, all right, how you doing? Everything okay? Yep, we're good. You good? Yes, we're good. All right, it's safe. Now we can start charging. And oh man, if only they had speakers and actually had that conversation. So what are your thoughts on this? I mean, I'm curious because I know where I stand, but I would imagine that.
So my first thought was, oh dang. But then I was like, wait a minute. Yeah, like nothing's happening, like you said, until you get the charger clipped in, and even like you're not sticking a fork in an outlet because it's not live yet for one, and you're not sticking a fork in the first place, even if it was. You're holding the outside of a whole lot of insulation. So even if for some reason that was completely live, it'd still be fine. But the two parts that kind of worry me there are, one, like you said, water. Even though the batteries are sealed, um, getting water above the bottom of the car, and just if you get other components, body components, interior components wet and soggy, it might take a little while for them um to dry off. And so would that prolonged moisture be an issue in some way, shape, or form? Maybe, maybe not, perhaps not. But the other part that had me worried most was that there's water around the base of the charging stations. I don't know enough about charging stations to know whether inside, like the Tesla supercharger, there's going to be circuits, I assume sealed or whatever, that floodwater is going to cause a problem with. So is the floodwater going to cause a problem with the charger itself? That would just make it so that, probably the result of that would just be that the car doesn't charge, or that the supercharger goes offline or whatever. Or worst case scenario, are there live wires, from the charger that are causing a problem with the surrounding water? So that was my big concern. But like you said, with the science, like, I get why that worked just fine. And so it might just be that I need to put aside personal bias, but there's a lot of people that know a whole lot less about this than we do.
Right.
So yeah,
So
that's where I'm from.
to kind of sum things up with that, my take is yes, it's safe. At any point, if it's not safe, the car or the charger are supposed to go, hey, this isn't safe, and we're not charging. So it's either it's safe or it won't work. Um, even knowing that, I don't think I would do this anyway. Like, it's, I don't know. It, I just wouldn't be comfortable with it. So what I would say to anybody is, yeah, perfectly safe, or it doesn't work. Oh, what happened?
Yeah, there we go.
That was weird. That's never happened before. Um, so perfectly safe, but I'm not gonna recommend anybody does it.
Yeah.
Just- it's just the way it is. Um, you had a story that you wanted to talk about, actually. So you're bringing this one up with GM. Do you want to dive into that, and then I think
Well,
we'll probably make that the last thing we talk about.
I don't know a whole lot about it, but I heard that GM is focusing less on full EV and more on hybrid. And it just, like, the vibe I've been getting from the industry of late is that they're like, let's stick with hybrids right now, like, and go with Toyota's model of, hey, we can create two batteries with a hybrid with the same amount of material that we would only be able to create one larger battery for a battery EV. And so I don't know if it's just a matter of supply and being able to get materials, or if it's something where it's a demand thing, like the demand for EVs just isn't what they thought it would be. But then I'm reading stuff saying, hey, the demand for EVs is still high, and there was, so many more EVs sold, like battery electric vehicles sold in 2023 than in 2022, and it's just continually growing. So I'm interested to see why GM and perhaps other manufacturers are going with plug-in hybrids more so than full battery electric vehicles, if it's a supply side or a demand thing.
Outside of Japanese manufacturers, the reason that I think GM is making this call, and we're not going to know why. And what
Not the
I've
real
learned
reason.
about GM over the years is, unless you're sitting there in the boardroom or a fly on the wall and involved, you're likely not going to hear whatever the real reason is for what they're doing or why they're doing it. They are very good at PR and communications and talking about what they're doing without ever saying the why, or very rarely. So this was basically a result of a comment that Mary Barra, who's the CEO, made on their last quarterly conference call. And basically, they're saying that it's a demand slash dealer thing because that's what the press is saying. I don't think we would be hearing GM say that if the negative press out there weren't already saying those things. I think that's low hanging fruit and something very easily to grab onto. Demand is still very high. Year on year, every quarter is basically an increase over the previous year. The only reason there was any kind of dip was that it was a quarter on quarter decrease in sales. Well,
that could be a bunch of different variables.
That could be a bunch of different variables. So I think the misinformation or the spinning of the truth, which I don't even know if it's like, yes, that was true, but that's not the important thing to worry about or think about. So I don't think demand is an issue. I do know that GM is struggling to build full battery electric vehicles on the Ultium platform. They have not, to the best of my knowledge, from what I'm being told, figured out how to mass produce those battery packs. I believe they're still building them by hand. At least the latest information that I've gotten is saying that they're building those battery packs by hand.
If they can get that licked, maybe we might have a low-cost EV.
That would be great.
Yeah.
GM typically will say what they believe people want to hear, regardless of whether they have an actual plan to do that or not. So I don't know. I'm a full supporter of plug-in hybrids as long as they're used the right way, as long as you plug them in. I know people who have bought plug-in hybrids and they don't plug them in. Now, yes, the battery will still recharge while it's driving, like a regular hybrid would. But they bought them because of the power that was available to use, like the Jeep Wrangler 4xe. Mm-hmm. The quickest, most powerful Jeep Wrangler that the company's ever made. So that's attractive. But people aren't plugging them in all the time. Plug-in hybrids are the best of both worlds, but they're also the worst of both worlds as well, where it's the least reliable. More things break on plug-in hybrids than even a just straight gasoline drivetrain.
There's more to break.
Yeah, it's more complicated.
There's just more components.
Mm-hmm. So I think that the US, and Canada, North America is not ready for full battery electric vehicles for the majority of people because there's too much uncertainty, there's too much misinformation, and the way to solve that is through experience. Well, if people haven't experienced even a taste of what going electric is like, then they're much less likely to actually make the jump to something that's full battery electric if they don't know anything about it and don't know how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a place for plug-in hybrids for the next few years, maybe 5 years or so. But anybody that I have talked to that had a plug-in hybrid that went to an EV did so because they experienced the electric side of it with the plug-in hybrid and went, ooh, this is really nice. I want this all the time.
Yeah.
You're one of the few people that I know that has gotten an all-electric car without very much experience with electric cars.
Oh, very little. Yeah.
I'm curious, actually, if you would just share a little bit of your reasoning and why, especially with a Chevy Spark. And I mean, I want to be transparent. I mean, people know that you bought the car from me, and clearly, being my brother, you're going to be influenced by the things that I say. But I'm curious, like,
bias present.
right? But why would you do that?
Sure. Well, like I mentioned before, my biggest selling point was the lack of parts. There's less to break. I wanted to set it and forget it. I didn't want to have to worry about doing all of the maintenance and regular service that a gas-powered car has. It's just basically worry about the suspension and the tires and not even the brakes, even because you're on the brakes a lot less. Mm-hmm. And I was like, you know what? I need something that is going to be really low maintenance and low cost of ownership. And, decreasing the amount that I was spending on gas and, dropping that by about a third or by about 2/3. I'm only paying about a third in electricity is what I would have been paying in gas previously. So yeah, that was it. It was was being budget conscious and didn't want to have to worry about a $5,000 car breaking down.
Sure.
And so I think the transition for me was easier in that I have a little bit of a tech background. I think it was basically a 20-minute conversation of going, here's the difference between kilowatts and kilowatt hours, and here's what you would expect for range. And when I was driving from Richmond back to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, I probably stopped 7 times to charge. No, I did stop 7 times to charge.
Yep.
And when I've made that trip more recently, I charged like 4 or 5 times because I wasn't nervous about, like, I didn't know anything about charging, but it took me about 2 charges to figure it out. And at home, it's just plug in, walk away, done.
Right.
And so the learning curve was there, but it wasn't particularly high. It was just kind of understanding what's on the dashboard and saying, here's what to do when you're at a public charging station. And that's pretty much it.
Sure. Your use case for the way you drive, I think,
which for people that don't know is I have about 14-mile one-way commute to get to work. And the range on this car, if I'm really pushing it in the wintertime, I might get down to 50 miles per charge because it's a small car. There's not enough room for a big battery. And in the summertime, on the other end of the spectrum, if I'm really easy on it, then I'm at more like 110 miles per charge.
With still a year old battery, about a year and a half old, which is the only reason I sold it to you. Where if the battery weren't new, I would have told you go and look at something else.
Well, your car's had a lot of track time too, so
yeah,
it might be a little bit more stressed than some people's.
Well, yeah, suspension components. But you mentioned the brakes.
Yeah,
the brake pads when I sold it to you were still the original brake pads,
and they're still fine. I mean,
so how many miles are on the car?
almost 92,000 miles on the car. Original brake pads, original brake fluid, and the maintenance schedule on the car says check the brake fluid every 5 years. That's it. That's all it says about the brakes. Done.
Yeah. That the American consumer is interesting, right? Because we buy what we want, not what we need. But yet, at a certain point, when you recognize the savings, where I never replaced the rear tires on that car ever for 50,000 miles. So, I mean, 4 sets of front tires, mind you, but never the rear tires. Never did anything with the brakes. Never did anything with the suspension. I mean, the only light bulbs I changed were the headlights because I wanted to.
I still haven't put a new dome light inside yet.
Yeah. So at what point will the US buyer go, I want to save all of that money, so I'm going to buy a plug-in hybrid because my normal trips are like yours, 14 miles, 20 miles a day or whatever. Yeah. Most plug-in hybrids can handle that kind of range on all electric. And then if you do go further, well, you have the gas engine for that. If people are plugging them in, they will see the same kind of savings you'd expect with an EV. Not quite as much because eventually the gas engine will kick on in service mode because you haven't used it enough. So it needs to run the fuel through, and it'll run through basically your entire tank of gas and require you to go out and buy new gas so that it stays in good shape. Chevy Bolt, back to GM and the plugins, the Chevy Bolt would do that. I think GM, it would be a good move for them short term to do that. I do not know if Chevy has any plans on how to adapt the Ultium platform to be a plug-in hybrid. So it'll be interesting to see what they end up doing. And things don't typically work quickly with GM. So they're making an announcement, but when will we see that? And if it's a year or 2 years from now, what's the market going to look like?
I wouldn't be surprised if it's 2026, and by that point, maybe BYD's coming online with their stuff, and other
Exactly.
manufacturers have like completely different models. And
Is GM? It seems to me that they don't know exactly where to focus, or they're just saying things to placate to the masses and say, oh yeah, we're going to do this, that, and everything else, while behind the scenes they're just singularly focused on what they're going to do anyway, and that's just not what they're talking about.
yeah.
I don't know. Either way, I think I would be more worried about GM if I didn't know that they're resilient and have so many connections to the US government. And I don't think that the government is going to let GM go out of business.
What's good for GM is good for the country.
Yeah, not going to respond to that. For the audio people, I made a face. So yeah, I'm going to let you summarize everything for this episode. Go ahead and kind of end it for us.
So BYD, which is a Chinese company that makes EVs, is going to be coming to the United States eventually. They're well on their way, and it looks like we might get some quality electric vehicles from them. We have a tax credit that is now applied as a rebate. So even if you don't have, like, if you aren't in the situation where you owe $7,500 in taxes, that you're still going to be able to take advantage of $7,500 discount on a new EV or $4,000 on a used EV, depending on the model. And it's probably safe to charge your car in a flood. Probably. And that pretty much takes care of it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know how long it's been, but I think it's been long enough. So we'll go ahead and end it. Before we do, I want to thank, as always, the Patreon supporters that support EV Resource. At the director tier, we have Rajeev, Narayan, and Andy Cooper. At the executive producer tier, we have Christopher Lawrence. And we do have a producer tier, which is $5 a month. There are a bunch of people there. Part of their benefits is that their names are listed in the show notes of the podcast. And their names get read out once a month versus every single episode. I did add a new top tier. It's the visionary tier. There's going to be some extra perks associated with that. So if you get a chance, head over to patreon.com/EV resource and you can take a look at everything that's involved with all of that. The upper tiers do have some merch with the new logo. So that's on there. And as soon as I figure out a maybe printful or something, I'm going to have merch available for everybody. So we'll see, but I'm gonna definitely be working on that, because I know there are people that want to have a EV Resource t-shirt or sweatshirt or whatever.
Yes, I do. I need merch.
Yeah, well, I'm working on it. It's only been a few years, but I'm getting there. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching and listening. And this has been John Hurst here. Yeah, John Hurst over there. That way. And I am
from
Zach
Richmond,
Hurst.
Virginia, Cyber Potato.
Cyber Potato. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time. You know what? I'll be Cyber Potato today.
Excellent.
Because the Cybertruck's out now, and I don't have one, but I have Cyber Potato. So
Right. Nice.